Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 173 of Manufacturing Hub with myself, Vlad, and Dave. Today, we're going to be continuing the theme of software in industrial automation and manufacturing. We had three great guests this month, and we're happy to continue the conversation between ourselves because I believe we have a very good perspective on the entire stack of industrial automation and manufacturing. We have only a couple of bullet points outlined, but I think just a few bullet points for this theme could probably take us up. It could be a 24-hour stream if we wanted to. So I think it's at the end of the day important to realize that software touches a lot of different areas inside of manufacturing, production, maintenance, engineering, and so we're going to do our best to break it down, provide our perspectives on some of the nuances, right, when it comes to selecting different software packages. I think we agreed not to go into too much detail and maybe not to be extremely vendor specific, but rather focus on what makes sense in a general sense. But if you guys have any questions, if you guys have any thoughts maybe for us during this episodes, definitely post them on LinkedIn, YouTube, or any other platform you are watching us on. Similarly, if you have any questions and if you're listening or viewing this after the episode has aired, if you want to reach out to us and have some of those conversations, even continue the discussion slash debate, whatever that might turn into, more than happy to address your questions and or comments. That being said, Dave, any thoughts before we begin with the first segment we've set out to start with?
Yeah, absolutely, Vlad. And I'm going to super echo your thoughts. I think it's been a really interesting 3 weeks that we've had so far. I'm interested and excited to go be able to share some of our perspectives in this. And I want to take a moment just to go thank our guests. I feel like we've got a bunch of really interesting perspectives. And to echo your other comments, that we're going to go talk up and down the technology stack a little bit. And we have come to what we hope is a bit of a middle ground that allows us to have a reasonable and mostly coherent conversation about most of the stack in less than 24 hours. Yeah, in less than 24 hours, because I think that's about where we'd be if you and I started to get into specific platforms and everything else. But again, if folks have interesting questions or comments about platforms, happy to go ahead and share that. I think any single one of the levels of this, from PLC through ERP and above, is 10 hours as soon as we start going and putting particular logos up and doing pros and cons. I've done that for a couple of clients in the past, Vlad, and just considering like what are the top X number 10, 20, 30 important parts of each software package. Then you compare them just across that particular ecosystem. It is a lot of time, and so I'm excited to go ahead and dig into this a little bit with you. So, Vlad, I'm going to ask you the question that I think you've asked all of our guests up until this point in time. What's the current state of software in manufacturing?
Yeah, and I think, look, that's an excellent starting point. And maybe, for me to provide that perspective, taking a quick step back even further, right? Like to maybe the fundamental definition of software, right? Ultimately, it is what runs and supports, I guess, in this case, manufacturing and automation systems. But ultimately, manufacturing is a business that does produce physical products, right? At this, I guess, juncture, we're not talking about standalone applications. We're not talking about mobile applications. So it's important to realize that in manufacturing specifically, everything comes from either that sensors or that comes from operator input. It comes from engineering input. So all of the systems are ultimately tied to some sort of a physical, maybe input or output. But then software allows us to transform that data from various input and output sources and present it in a better way then I want to say a human would not be able to read otherwise, right? I think that fundamentally that's what software allows us to accomplish. So, what is the current state of software in manufacturing, right? So, my opinion on this, and I mentioned this to, I guess, in a couple of episodes, is that I
Mhm.
believe that there's a lot of different tools on the market at every stack, at every layer of the ISA model, which we will discuss in a couple of moments. But I believe that there's still a lot of bottlenecks when it comes to networking, which allows that extraction of data from sort of the more lower level of I want to say like hardware that interfaces the actual production line into some of the higher levels such as MES and ERP layers. So I think there's a lot of opportunity on sort of getting the physical layers correct before software can be exploited to its fullest potential. And I also believe that the uh, the focus, I guess, and we'll get into this as we continue the conversation, is usually on the software, but I think that the human aspect is a lot of times not necessarily ignored, but I want to say not put as much emphasis on, which means that in at least a lot of my projects, the full potential of software was not taken advantage of, if that makes sense. I think that the state of software, like I said, there's a lot of opportunity to getting the actual data into the software packages, and I think there's a lot of opportunity of sort of helping people understand software a lot better to get
Mhm.
the full potential out of what is possible. What are your thoughts on the current state of affairs?
Absolutely. I would agree with that. And I think I want to dig into a couple of those points a little bit more. Talking about the software, I think not only are there maybe physical roadblocks or networking limitations or human interaction limitations if we don't use the software as well as we possibly could, but I think it's also, we're at an interesting point, right? We have groups who are using various pieces of this software that are 20 plus years old, especially if we look back at some of the PLCs, we've got software that hasn't changed very much in 20 or 30 or more years. And beyond that, we have a whole bunch of new startups looking to go talk at, a variety of different points. So we've got groups who have basically done very little for 30 years. We've got groups who are brand new 6 months old. And so we've also got a bunch of now maturing organizations. And so when I think we talk about software in manufacturing, it's a very interesting point, and I'm not sure there's ever been as many opportunities to get the correct software for what you are looking for as an organization, but I'm not sure it's ever been more confusing, right? We look at the 90s, there was one HMI SCADA platform that all of the new age groups were looking at, and there was one or two PLCs. And now we look today, and we could probably come up with 2 dozen different PLC or 2 dozen different SCADA platforms. And Vlad and I had a difficult time coming up with a short list of potential PLC groups yesterday, just because it seems every time you turn, someone has a different flavor of PLC. And are we going to use it for everything? Are we going to use it for very particular things? And there is lots of software that goes along with that. And I want to go kind of touch again on the enablement part. Again, I think enablement is has never been more important and will continue to be more and more important. What? Oh, Arduino. Yeah. I'd like to note we made it 8 minutes and 9 seconds into the stream before Vlad showed a piece of product that isn't including product currently behind his head. So everyone at home in the podcast ears, give Vlad a round of applause. But no, I think at the enablement side, it is more and more important and will always continue to be more important. And I think we're going to see groups of people who are successful versus groups of people who are not successful based upon how well they work on the enablement side. I'll just kind of one other point. I talk to and work with a number of different software groups every single year, right? I probably in the last 6 years have talked to 5 dozen, 5 dozen, 60 different groups. And you can really see how early stage they are depending upon the people are going to see that we solve X, Y, and Z problem. And they're immediately going to love us and they're going to buy us and they're going to find a way to implement as kind of very, very early through the point of, hey, we have to have consultants, we have to have trainers, we have to have coaches, we have to have whatever the word is we're going to use, go and work with the different people on the plant floor to go get it actually implemented. So I think it's interesting to see the progression of different stages of organizations. Vlad, I want to go ask you about PLCs, right? Guys, if you didn't read the title, we're going to go through and talk about the different stack. I'll read the not so short list that we've got, so you guys know what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about PLCs. We're going to talk a bit about Edge. We're going to talk about like third-party IIoT style solutions. We'll talk about SCADA. We'll talk about MES. We'll talk about ERP. We'll talk about cloud. And we've got some more in there as well if we somehow manage to get through all of this, which is at least as many bullet points as we ever have with guests. So, Vlad, you are absolutely the PLC guru in general, and certainly when the two of us are having a conversation. Tell us your thoughts on where we are software for PLCs.
Yeah, so I think, we wanted to break this down into a couple of different points, right? So there's sort of the software which is used to program PLCs, which is your IDE, your Studio 5000, TIA portal, like the Arduino IDE. Then there's the simulation tools, right? So those are going to be also typically released by OEMs, but there's a lot of third parties that are now starting to integrate into those. So essentially allowing the PLC code to be simulated a little bit better. And that could be plant simulations, but a lot of times it is your code simulations. And I think last but not least, we wanted to talk about standardization and sort of negotiation. And I think that's I guess, a higher level topic, but we'll get to it in a second. So when it comes to programming and developing PLC code, right? So I think that every single OEM is releasing an update to their IDE on a very frequent basis. So I know that the major groups, and again, when I say major groups, you probably can guess which ones I'm talking about. There's a dominant player in the North American market, a dominant player in the European market. They release a new IDE with upgrades on a yearly basis, and then there's going to be smaller players which either patch those tools a little bit quicker or release something on a monthly to quarterly basis. And again, I'm not going to mention the specific names. You can very easily find who makes those controllers. That being said, I think that I guess a couple of thoughts, right? So I don't think that the languages, right? And when I say languages, it's the PLC languages, ladder logic, structured text, function block diagrams, etc., have fundamentally changed that much since the last, I want to say, even couple of decades. I think what is slowly changing is we're adding more and more tools that help you develop faster, that make the idea a bit more usable. I want to say as compared to some of the other programming tools. So I think it's slowly converging to what VS Code has become on the, I want to say, the traditional software slash IT side. But it really depends, right? And I say that in a very general sense because I know that certain OEMs keep a much more, I want to say, closed environment, and it's not necessarily changing as much as it should. But that's the, I want to say, in a very general and broad sense. I think we'll get into more specifics on that side. That is what I'm seeing in the PLC programming space. I don't think there's any like fundamental changes that I'm seeing. So I think that we're going to uh, look. I think some OEMs are trying to integrate more open environments, and they're trying to add external code, whether that's on C sharp or that's in Python or that's in whatever other like programming language you'd like. But I would say that those are maybe the exceptions, not the norms, based on my conversations with customers. What are your thoughts, Dave, on the PLC side?
Yeah, I would agree. I think that we are pretty set on the IEC 61131-3 programming languages on the PLC side. And I would agree with you that I feel like it's less we're changing necessarily those languages outside some maybe bleeding edge groups who are trying different languages as a whole, and more we are somewhere between having conversations and groups are actively using these languages differently. I think it's not all that long ago that basically everything was written in ladder logic, right? And I think now we're certainly seeing more groups look outside of ladder logic, either to write 100% of things or maybe to write some particular things, scripts, all in ones, et cetera, because they work better as a function block or object oriented programming. Or we see some newer people who haven't learned ladder logic and we see structured text or another one of these programming languages that they're more comfortable with because they are closer to typical historical programming that they've done. So I see more of the change in that. I feel like we'll add features and functions when it comes to the PLC programming side, but I think we're going to add it into how can we create all-in-ones? How can we create libraries? How can we open up what we've historically been doing so that we can allow more people to become comfortable with PLC programming or perhaps programming in general? And I think when we talk about that, I think we'll see more and more different types of simulation tools and other tools such as that will allow groups to go through the process to figure out kind of what it is that they want to do and how they can go through the process of getting the most people up and running.
Mhm. I think, look, the important conversation to be had, right, is I believe that in a general sense, and I think we discussed this a little bit yesterday off stream, which is that in many, I want to say, facilities, as an engineer, as a technical lead, you rarely have the choice, I want to say, of hardware, and the software is sort of prescribed based on the hardware you have on the plant floor, right? So I think that it's important to recognize, and I think we should discuss some of these nuances a little bit before we move on from PLCs in a general sense. But I believe that there are factors which impact the choice of software that are beyond just maybe the engineer's desire to innovate or maybe do things differently or utilize some of the newer tools, right? And I can maybe start off on this train of thought by saying that in many manufacturing facilities, what typically happens is you do not have purchasing or negotiation power that is strong enough for the builder or the machine, let's call it seller, vendor, to revamp their control system to what you need, right? So to give a specific example, I worked in, very large corporate environments early in my career, which meant that we could essentially dictate to the machine builders exactly what kind of systems they would build before they shipped it onto the factory floor, which, based on North America, you can pretty much assume what the control system was, right? So we were very
Mhm,
standardized on Studio and Ars Logix 5000. There was very little choice to be done on that side. Now, if you go into an industry that is, I want to say, with less negotiation power, maybe a smaller manufacturer, you pretty much get whatever you can based on the cost of the machine, right? So, what does that mean in practice? Well, if you're going to have a line that has, a filler, let's call it a packer, a palletizer,
mhm,
a sleever, whatever those machines are, you're going to buy the machine, and that machine could come with an Allen Bradley controller. It could come with a Mitsubishi, Omron, Siemens, all sorts of different flavors of controllers. And so now, if you're an engineer at that specific facility, you're almost stuck, or I guess not necessarily stuck. You have the job of learning all of those software packages in order to not only maintain the machinery but also to integrate that between there's going to be some handshake signals, there's going to be some data signals between machines. So I think it's important to recognize that the choice of hardware, which then induces the I guess the usage of software, is not always up to the person that's maintaining those machines. And I think what I want to maybe bring to light is that there are nuances and pluses and minuses in going one route versus the other, right? So, and again, I guess I'll put my first thought into that as well, Dave. I think the ability to consolidate and standardize on a single or maybe at most two control systems is extremely important because it reduces, number one, the cognitive load on the engineers looking to understand those systems. And I think, both you and I have a good
mhm,
understanding that if you know how to program a PLC, yes, you can transfer the knowledge from one platform to the other, but chances are that you will know the language and you'll program the PLCs the same way, but you're not going to know all the nuances and all the errors and all the, like the weird aspects of that specific platform for a while. I think that's where the learning curve comes in. And so if you start having four or five platforms within a single site, it becomes extremely difficult to learn and sort of maintain the software knowledge in your head at the same time, unless you have a big enough workforce, right? So I think it puts
mhm,
a different type of pressure on the manufacturer. And not only that, they're also interviewing people who they hope become an engineering team on their own in a matter of weeks, if not months. So I think it's important to recognize what software choices mean for your specific facility. And I think it's also important to recognize how do you create a plan that becomes sustainable and sort of consolidates some of these machines into either one or two platforms, again, for a couple of reasons that I've just mentioned. What are your thoughts on that
Absolutely.
side, Dave?
I I agree with you to the most extent, Vlad. I think that it's always what do we standardize, and as we have discussed here on the channel at length, it's always the what is most important, right? What is important to the organization, and at the end of the day, that's uptime and continuing running. It's can I standardize on parts, and so I think for most groups, it makes sense to standardize on the smallest number of pieces of hardware, the smallest number of pieces of software that is possible. Now, is it always a fun R&D experiment because we've only got one PLC and maybe the PLC doesn't include motion, maybe it doesn't include safety or some other things? No, not necessarily, but at the end of the day I think it's the at the organization's best efforts and most important, to continue to stay up. I think that as you go and look at, do I divest some of my resources time to learn another platform? Do I perhaps have a different platform with the PLC running one or two different areas so we can get used to it? I think it becomes there can be a steep learning curve, and people would generally have to do that after they've already done their 40 or 50 or 60 hours of firefighting and troubleshooting over the course of the day. So I think it becomes difficult. I feel like we have lived through a what we can only hope is a once in a lifetime issue with COVID and the pandemic, of the supply chain absolutely collapsing. And yeah, I feel like we've already lived through that. So the best we can do is to hope that it's not going to happen again. And as I told Vlad, if it were me, I would take that money and I would go put some spare parts on the shelf. Vlad has seen lots of those spare PLCs go and walk away for a variety of reasons. But I maybe not the shelf that everyone can get to, but like a locked desk drawer behind a locked office in a locked engineering wing, if that's what you have to do in order to make sure that you can have those spare parts. I'd rather take the money and have some spare parts, and then worst case scenario, we're at the same point and we've got to bring some groups on in order to go through the process of figuring out how we can get up and running on a different piece of controller or hardware that we have to go find and get in.
Yeah, and I think, like, look, at the end of the day, you need to figure out how to mitigate risk for your organization, right? I think it was not a, how to say, normal business as usual type of an environment what we saw a couple of years ago. But it's important to recognize that depending on, again, the size, or I want to say the significance or the spend of your facility, you could have been, declined hardware purchases for months, if not years at a time, right? So if you
Yeah,
were very focused on a single platform, you had an engineering team who only knew a single platform, from one day to the next, you were told that, the PLC, or, and I think, PLCs are maybe only one part of the entire picture, because I think PLCs don't fail that frequently. A lot of times it would
yeah,
be, like drives or servo motors, or devices that, let's say, fail a little bit more often. But we're bundling all of that sort of at this layer. But ultimately, what happened is, if you were a smaller organization, you could no longer get parts of that, let's say, preferred OEM that you were standardized on. So you were left scavenging, I want to say, for parts from a different OEM you were not as familiar with. So to your point, look, I agree that you should protect yourself and have your own interest as much as possible, whether that's through stocking more parts, whether that's learning a second platform. But of course, if you don't have a workforce that's able to support that effort, it also doesn't make sense. So I want to avoid painting a picture that it's a one size fits all recommendation, but rather you should probably bring somebody in that understands industrial automation, that can audit the systems, that can see what you're currently using. And there's a path to standardizing, there's also maybe a path to mitigating certain risks, whatever they might be, for that specific industry or for that specific business or facility, for that matter. um
absolutely.
Moving on to edge devices, Dave, can you, I think we didn't fully, I guess, like, discuss edge in a general sense. Could you define what an edge device is in your understanding?
Oh, that's a great question, Vlad. I mean, to some extent, edge devices are PLCs that we've had on the machine forever. To a broader extent, it is, I guess, in my opinion, some amount of compute that lives on the machine or line side. So it could be a PLC, it could be an IPC, an industrial PC. It could be something as simple as like a Raspberry Pi. It could be kind of any of those devices. Lots of time we see edge devices very explicitly for like data extraction outside of the PLCs that we have for control, or perhaps the IPCs that we also use for control. Most of the time when we talk about edge devices as standalone edge devices, they're used to have additional sensors, to have additional inputs outside of the control loop, so that we can go send it someplace else, be it someplace physically network to the system at the facility, be it someplace, what are the words I'm in the cloud, kind of any and everywhere from there.
Interesting. I guess our definition differs a little bit because to me, let's say a PLC is a purely control dedicated device, right? Of course, a PLC can be made to do other things. You can write an ERP or even an MES software on a PLC, but I think a PLC's primary function is always control. Whereas
Mm-hmm.
for me, an edge device is purely, I guess, the main point of an edge device is for data either extraction or processing. You can run, right? We've discussed that you can run code assist on an edge device because at the end of the day, it can run on any Linux environment. But to me, that seems to be an exception rather than the rule. And I would almost say that if a I would call that more of an IPC than an edge. I guess an IPC is a subset of an edge device, but an IPC to me is dedicated for control more so than a very generalized kind of application runtime
Mm-hmm.
than an edge device, versus an edge device is just data extraction and processing.
Well, an edge device is something that lives on the edge. A PLC lives on the edge. An IPC lives on the edge. If you've got a line side server, it almost lives on the edge, right? Um, so I define an edge device as
So they're
something that
all
lives
edge
on an edge.
devices. Huh.
Exactly. I think they are all, in the greater extent, especially if you and I somehow manage to make it to cloud, they're all edge devices. They are hardware that live on the edge of the line or the edge of the machine. Everything above it's hardware that lives on the edge of the machine. I think that is the key importance. I think we've used edge devices a lot when we talk about data collection for like IoT and other devices such as that. But I still define an edge device as something that lives on the edge, which would include a PLC.
So I guess everything is a subset of an edge device that is within, let's say, a machine cabinet. Is like a drive an edge device? Like is a
I
server
would
drive
I
an
would define an edge device as needing to have compute, right? Like it has to have some sort of processing power, as much as $500,000 IPC, as little as I don't know, $20 Arduino or $20 Raspberry Pi. But I would say it all needs to have some sort. I would define edge devices as needing to have some amount of compute, because otherwise, literally everything is an edge device. Literally every subsegment of the line is an edge device.
But isn't there some compute on the servo drives? Like what amount of compute do you need for it to be an edge device?
Hmm, I don't know. I suppose if it's like one of those newer smart servos that you and I saw that you can plug an Ethernet in and do whatever it is that you want to do with them and can go pull data directly from it, it could be an edge device. I'm open to a broad interpretation of edge device.
So what's the I guess the distinction between an IPC and a PLC? Because they're both edge devices.
Yeah. I think an
Like
IPC generally has more computational power to it than a PLC. And I think a PLC is very much control first, right? Like PLC is very much control first. I think you can do a lot of things beyond just control with an IPC. But then you get into like that strange middle ground. Like we've got we've talked a lot about Opto 22, and they're like, oh, but Benson's gonna have to like send me some messages during this. But they have like that onboard HMI that you can go ahead and build. That I don't remember if it lives in the cloud, it lives on the device, it lives somewhere in there. I think it lives on the device, and you can go ping it with an IP address. And Vlad just turned that on. Thank you for doing that, Vlad. So I think it gets a little bit murky as to what you want to do. But I would consider an edge device a device that lives on the edge and has compute.
Well, that's why they're called PACs.
I mean, we're not going to get into that. We are already 30 minutes in and have managed to get to bullet
All right.
point 2.5. So let's not get into PACs. Um, let's continue from just the particular edge devices, and let's include some of these third-party solutions, IIoT solutions, and other things. Vlad, I know you wanted to go add this in. What are your thoughts on that? Maybe where they live, because that is very much a blend of hardware and software, is least as much, if not more, than anything else that we have here.
Yeah, well, I think, you started on that maybe a train of thought of what a PLC versus what an IPC is, right? And ultimately, for me, in the current market, a PLC is going to be doing mostly control, right? Control the line, control the equipment, control maybe, a portion of the facility, but an IPC can technically run any, let's call it, application on top of it, right? And I think that the opportunity is to understand what is available at the IPC level. And to me, most of the time, that's either data extraction to those higher levels. It could be data manipulation, which in most cases is required to have a cohesive stream. It could also be running applications that we'll discuss at the other layers, but it could be high byte, it could be inductive automations, ignition, it could be like the edge version, right? It could be running node red for whatever, like proof of concept, or maybe like smaller workflows. It could also be running a web server that just displays some kind of data that is pseudo MES or ERP level esque like. So I think the point I'm trying to make here is that there's a lot of software options for, let's call it, IPCs slash edge devices at this layer. And maybe to transition us also to third party, right? So I put some question marks on that side because number one, that includes IIoT solutions, which to me are, maybe a little bit more proprietary, sort of like sensors slash this hub slash edge device aggregator, with or without cloud integration, for viewing a narrow set of data that could be vibration monitoring, or that could be literally a few photo eyes that will measure the flow of your process. But it could also mean, I put like third party, I included CMMS there, right? So CMMS is a maintenance software, which again, I think doesn't fall into any category of the stack, but it's a very important component of, let's call it, of a maintenance department, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
to me, that probably lives at the same level as maybe like a MES or an ERP, and we'll talk about those distinction later. But I think there's a lot of tools that are not classified as edge that would fall into this, third party slash question mark inside of manufacturing and industrial automation. What are your thoughts?
I think that there are nearly endless tools. I think that there are nearly endless tools when it comes to that, and I think most groups go through the thought of, hey, I'm gonna pick best in class tools for everything, and then try to integrate it to, hey, maybe I don't need all of these tools. Maybe I can go build everything myself on one or two platforms. To, hey, my platforms are really good at X, Y, and Z things. Let's go pick a couple of different tools beyond what my core platform looks like in order to go get some of these best in class services. So I think it's interesting when we talk about these solutions, from vibration monitoring to CMMS, like our conversation with Chris last week was, which I thought was super interesting. If you guys want to learn more about CMMS, Chris works for Maintainx. So if you guys want to learn more about that, and or if you want to learn more about very much kind of the after the sales process, like what's important pre-sale, and then how do you go make sure you find success after the sale, definitely go ahead and take a listen to episode 172 with Chris Hudson, which was last week. Having said that, I think it's an interesting space, as I had mentioned kind of towards the beginning, of any and everything is possible. Yeah, any and everything is possible when it comes to third party solutions. And I think it'll be interesting to see how many of those third party solutions live through what I imagine will be an inevitable roll up, to use Vlad's word, of we're going to combine and condense a bunch of these. It was a Vlad MBA term from earlier in the week, folks.
There's a lot of
But
cases for that. So I guess
no,
just to expand a little
yeah,
quicker on what Dave is saying. So there's a lot of vendors slash companies creating very similar tools in inside of manufacturing, right? And an example of that would be like a simple MES solution. And so the roll up the tail strategy on the business side is essentially buying out or consolidating, let's call it 10 or 20 companies into a single solution, which then gives us economy of scale because ultimately then you have one engineering team, you have maybe one sales team instead of distributed 10 across very different products that are trying to achieve virtually what you could call the same end result for the end user who's the manufacturer. And I think all of us know a lot of different solutions, even when it comes to IoT tools, right? Like a lot there's I think like five companies doing vibration sensor monitoring, if not more, right? I can name a couple at the top of my head, but ultimately there's an opportunity to consolidate that and to maybe build a larger platform that yeah, that can get to economies of scale. Sorry, go ahead, Dave.
absolutely. But no, no, I think it'll be interesting as you and I have talked, especially as we've talked with a bunch of these smaller groups. I think that we are living through, or maybe towards the end of the golden age of all of these different groups with all of these different flavors. I imagine that we will see a roll up or a shrinkage of all of the different options in the near future. Having said that, if there is a need for a CMMS or literally any other tool, don't wait 3 to 5 years. Go find what you guys think is the best tool and make sure that you own the data, which I think is an interesting segue to a conversation Vlad and I were having last night of making sure that you own the data. As I was sharing with Vlad, I saw, I think it was last week or a week and a half ago, Redbox, which for anyone who isn't a movie fan or probably American, I don't, it was Redbox in Canada, Vlad?
I think so, but I guess
Okay.
I've not subscribed.
Perfect. So I know that there used to be red boxes in the United States. I don't know if they were anywhere else. I, in fact, sadly, have never rented one, which I feel like is a loss at this point. But Redbox was a movie DVD rental location that apparently had an app that you could go buy movies from. And they went chapter 7 bankruptcy. So they've gone out of business. They're selling all of their assets. And as they go through the process of selling all their assets, they shut the app down, which was the only way you could get to the movies that you've purchased. So I read somewhere that someone had lost tens of thousands of dollars in movies that they had purchased, which is one wild to me that anyone would spend tens of thousands of dollars in movies, but I think really hammers home the point of knowing who owns your data and your information. What happens if this group doesn't last, right? Like if Vlad and I were to do something and we both decided we didn't want to do it anymore and the company went bankrupt, what would happen with your data, your information, all of that? So I think that that's a really, really important tale. Vlad, any other thoughts on third party applications?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the example you gave is a B2C type of an application. I think the same happens in the industrial or enterprise side with
Mhm.
examples from Google shutting down, I think it was last year, IoT Core, and AWS continuously shutting down some of the services. And again, I think it's not to instill fear based on some of those shutdowns. But I think the message here is that whenever you involve any closed systems or third party vendors that completely lock you down, you're obviously exposing yourself to the risk of, at a minimum, maybe losing weeks of engineering time. But I
Mhm.
think at a maximum, losing a ton of data that in some industries could be, regulatory, and so you could be maybe in trouble if that happens. So I think always thinking through when you're deploying any of these software solutions, whether that's at the PLC or ERP or cloud level, what is the risk of some of these tools or some of these vendors or services going away? To your example, it could happen pretty easily. And again, I think it's also important to look at the history. What has the company done? How big is it? How big is your business to them? Because I think that carries out a lot of importance. What do we think
Agreed.
about SCADA, Dave? SCADA, very
So
interesting. Yeah,
I kind of want to lump, at least in the beginning, SCADA and MES, the layers that we were talking about together,
yeah,
because I think on most of the newer solutions that you see coming out, or people building, especially if you're building from the beginnings or doing a major upgrade, you see SCADA and MES very much intertwined. Outside of just you almost certainly need the SCADA information in order to go deliver your MES results. But I see those very intertwined and very much kind of mirroring the beginning of our conversation. I think SCADA and MES at those particular levels, we have never seen more groups have slightly different flavors of what is basically the same thing. And maybe it's a different geographical area, maybe it's a different segment of an industry. I know and have worked with and have talked to, again, dozens and dozens of different groups who have SCADA, and lots of times it honestly surprises me, like the logos of the customers they have. And it's like, I've been doing this for 10 years. How did I not know about this particular group? So I think SCADA and MES both are very interesting levels when it comes to that. I've got more thoughts, but I want to let you, I want to give you a chance to put your early thoughts in as well, Vlad.
yeah. I mean, I think for me, maybe it's important to define what SCADA, MES, or maybe SCADA and MES layers are. But my view is, SCADA is a layer which allows you to control maybe larger areas of a
Mm-hmm.
production floor. And I want to emphasize, the control portion, because obviously SCADA also has data in the acronym,
Mm-hmm.
versus an MES to me is a purely data or sort of analytics based layer, right? So at the MES layer, you're not necessarily going to be starting and stopping lines. You're mostly looking at the performance of how the shop floor, the manufacturing floor is doing. So I think that's where the distinction is. But I definitely agree that if you're looking at software packages that want to span across both of those functions, I really don't see the value in, bringing in, let's call it, one vendor for MES, one vendor for SCADA in, 2024 and beyond. I think that one single vendor for both of those layers makes a lot more sense. And again, we can get into that discussion, but ultimately I think it just saves dollars on the integration side. I really don't see it any other way. You're just going to be paying more. And of course, if you want some very custom or different solution, sure, but expect to pay a lot more for those packages to be separate, because there's going to be engineering challenges involved on that side.
Absolutely. And to kind of continue down that thought, that they each of them can be expensive packages on their own. And so going through and understanding what you want is important. A lot of times it's what do the packages offer. Sometimes there are specific things that you may not realize you need, or you want on the front end but don't know what that looks like. And a lot of time when I talk to different groups, a lot of it's on the reporting side, right? Like, and I feel like groups go one of two ways. One of two ways is, yeah, we probably need some reporting. Maybe here's the minimum requirements that are necessary to stay compliant, or we want 500 reports and we want you to build all of these reports slightly differently so that we can go press a button and it goes and prints the report you want. So I see a lot of that on both sides. And I think it's interesting. I think a lot of it goes to requirements. I think a lot of it goes to requirements, and there's a lot of upfront time and thinking. And especially on the product selection and requirements side, when we talk about SCADA and MES, I don't think there's a better way to save time and money on the development process of these than to spend the time and money up front to determine exactly what you need and what hardware you're connecting with, and make sure the team that you're bringing in to go build this is ready to go, and you've gotten through the first 20 hurdles. I have never seen a group who I've never seen a group who says we'll go fix it in process, not cost themselves tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars more if they don't have good requirements on the front end. It's a bit of a pet peeve of mine that I think Vlad has heard once or 400 times. Once or 400 times in the past.
Yeah, and I think like look to expand on that maybe a little bit further, Dave. I think again the distinction between the two layers is a SCADA will provide data that is unfiltered, right? So you could see, let's say, the level of a tank, you can see the temperature of a tank, you can see maybe what the set points are. So that's SCADA information. But at the MES level, you want someone to put the thought in on how do you track, let's call it a batch. How do you understand, OE tracking? How do you process quality? How do you not only, like taking a, let's call it a reject signal that's coming out from your checkware, but how do you integrate that into, like a shift schedule? So you're doing a lot more legwork to, I guess, create reports that provide a lot more detail for the people that make decisions. And I think for me, the rule of thumb has always been to question what are we going to do with the data that is provided, right? And if there's no clear path to, I guess, to that answer, usually is because you just simply don't need it at that time, right? So I've seen way too many groups go down the path of collect data that they would just look at, whether that's on a weekly or monthly basis, but not necessarily know or not act on it at all. So I think at that point, the money becomes wasted and there's not a sense of ROI based on, as you mentioned, fairly expensive tools, a lot of engineering work involved in, processing that information. That could also mean, at the end of the day, it could not be just the base package. You're buying modules that allow you to not only process that but present that information. So, anyways, I think the trap and the important question is once we get the specific data, what are we actually going to do with it? And if there's no clear answer, I simply think it's going to lead to failure. It needs to be discussed before you start anything. To be honest with you.
I would agree with that. And so before I talk about potentially blowing up the historic SCADA and then MES stack, Vlad, do you have a definition that you want to give for what the minimum items needed for an MES to be is? Would you like me to give a definition for everyone to disagree? Which direction would you like to go?
Um, I can throw in, I guess, a couple of thoughts. So for me, like I said, the distinction between SCADA and MES is pretty clear. I think SCADA is just raw data in most cases. An
Mhm.
MES, we can start calling it an MES as soon as it synthesizes data from a SCADA or plant floor hardware into something that is easier to digest for a human, right? And that could be as simple as picking up a couple of sensors, combining that with shift data, and now it's showing us OEE, right? Like it's just counting the number of boxes in front of a sensor. There you go. That's the most basic MES that I can think of.
So let me ask, Vlad, would you consider it above SCADA if we take, I don't know, like a level sensor and figure out what the delta of that is over the course of 24 hours? Like, is that above the level of SCADA? Because I would consider that, and again, I think it's where the lines blur.
So I think again, if you just present the level, that
Hmm.
goes in SCADA territory. But if you
Hmm.
start, let's say, like what was the delta over, let's call it an hour or a shift
Hmm.
period, or maybe like a week, that
Yep.
becomes an MES
Okay.
because you've
Interesting.
synthesized like two sets of data into like one piece of information.
Interesting. I think it's where it goes, where everything becomes a bit more convoluted, if you will, right? Like I think everything becomes a bit more convoluted because I wouldn't balk at someone showing me the delta over a period of time on a SCADA And maybe it's the fact of kind of where I've lived and the groups I've lived and work with, and lots of them don't have historic, or we're looking to go rebuild historic SCADAs and MESs, and so the screens kind of become a combination of a variety of things, as opposed to very rigid. Only this is the only thing that we have. Vlad, as I said, kind of what I've come to the conclusion of in the last 6 to 12 months is really asking the question of, do organizations need the historic SCADA and or MES layers? And asking the questions are there third party applications? Are there other things that can be built at a fraction of the cost that allows you to get most of the way there, but doesn't cost the same amount of money, doesn't have the overhead? And I think it's an interesting conversation that I continue to go play around with, because especially as we look at some of these other third party apps, and I won't mention any of their names, but I've seen them at plant floors, and it's basically, hey, we have put sensors on an edge device, and most of those edge devices are like micrologics. And then we go throw it back up to the cloud, and we go visualize some of that data in a iOS app, and then we can export to Tableau or Power BI or whatever the tool you want if you want more data and information. So for me, it becomes kind of the question and the thought of, do we need these very rigid SCADA and MES layers, especially if groups are not going to use them, right? I think there are lots of groups who use tools like this, or who use these tools or tools like this, like a lot of OSI Soft Pi time series data. I've seen people who can pull the same information, sometimes better information than what I see in lots of the MESs, right? So I think there are lots of different ways that groups can go. And I think it will be interesting to see how rigid this stack continues to be and or becomes in the future.
I look, my opinion is I don't think the stack is rigid at all, in the sense that I think, as you said, like the lines are blurred. I could design a HMI based application that will track a
Mhm.
batch through the entire process, right? Does that make the HMI now an MES or even an ERP system? Well, like again, I could also add messaging to an HMI. Does it become a smartphone, right? Like it's kind of one of those things where I don't think it really matters to maybe set hard lines. I think what's really important, to bring this back to the end user, is what information do we need to solve the challenges that we're facing. And if I'm, walking into a facility, and if I ask them the question of, hey, how well has this line ran in the last, like 4 months over, let's call it a week's long period, they're unable to answer that. It tells me a lot about their operation, right? And then that's only the surface level question. Next question becomes, well, they show me some kind of a batch tracking system or maybe production tracking system. I see a huge drop or a huge spike. And then I ask them, well, like what happened, during the shift? They're unable to answer that question. Well, then it becomes a discussion around, do you have the data? Do you have the right information to be able to resolve some of these issues? And then how much are those issues worth to you, right? So I
Mhm.
think that's the fundamental question that needs to be asked when it comes to selecting these tools, implementing these tools. And if you can get that done with a prox at the end of the line that then gets recorded, on a notebook by someone and then entered maybe into Excel, then more power to you, right? But I think in this day and age, as you mentioned, there's a lot of tools that can make that happen, whether they sit at the SCADA, MES, ERP level. I think is not as important as what they can actually provide as a solution. So I think the lines are getting blurred, but I don't think that's a huge that is not a big importance to end users or manufacturers. To be honest with you, I think if you ask maybe ops managers or plant managers, they might know the acronyms, but I really don't think that they know it at a level deep enough to like truly care about the distinctions, if that makes sense.
I I would agree with that. For all the folks in the comments, if you guys have thoughts on MES or SCADA or anything along those lines, please feel free to go ahead and drop them in the comments below. Vlad and I could do hours and hours on any one of these particular topics, but we are trying to be true to the format that is Manufacturing Hub and give everyone a bit of an overview when it comes to that and allow everyone to continue to build on from that. Vlad, do you want to go tackle ERPs?
Yeah. So I think, let me first define ERP. I think that when we talk to an audience of industrial automation or manufacturing professionals, I would not assume that everyone knows each one of these layers. So ERP stands for Enterprise Resource Planning. And a lot of times it is sort of the software layer that will encompass the business, right? And so what I mean by the business is usually it's going to be your accounting, right? So what is being paid to, let's call it vendors, what is being owed by suppliers, vice versa, what is maybe stuck or in process in logistics, how is the warehouse doing, right? Like what kind of materials do we have on hand? It also incorporates some of the data from the MES in the sense that, let's say, if we've produced, at a 60% OEE, chances are, obviously you can apply statistics. We will be continuing to produce at that rate. So how much raw materials do we need for next week's production runs? So long story short, ERP is what allows us to plan what is going to be produced on the plant floor, but also how do we pay the suppliers of raw materials? How do we ship the goods once they're finalized or inside of the warehouse? It could also incorporate, how do you pay employees? And, there's going to be a lot of sort of different tools within an ERP that will address these different or more niche applications. That being said, I come from a very large corporate environments. So in my past, I've seen a lot of SAP, which is one of the dominant ERP systems I want to say out there in the world. To be honest with you, I don't know what the maybe top five players are. But I will say that there's a lot of sort of smaller ERP players as well, because you want to be able to address smaller markets in a way that makes sense for them, right? So again, maybe if you stay within manufacturing, then you probably have similar needs. But if you go to a business that, I don't know, let's call it a hospital, right? If you're operating a hospital will also have an ERP, but the ERP is going to be fundamentally different than from the one in manufacturing. So although both of them can technically probably use SAP, a lot of times they will use something that is adapted for that industry. So I guess just setting the stage of what an ERP is. What are your thoughts, Dave, maybe of ERPs being integrated to maybe manufacturing or industrial automation data at this current stage?
Yeah, I think that it really depends upon the organization that you are and how large you are. So I think most of the Fortune 50, Fortune 500, Fortune 1 or 2000 probably have SAP, especially if they're looking to grow, especially if they're looking to grow and or potentially sell in the future. SAP is what all in my view the vast majority of major enterprises have. What I think is really interesting when we go talk about ERPs is the fact that there are so many ERPs that are very segment focused, right? So when I was a distributor manufacturer's rep, we used an ERP. It was called Profit 21. It's an Epicor. It's an Epicor solution that was very much kind of like the gold standard. If you are like a medium to large size distributor manufacturer's rep, that is pretty much the ERP that the vast majority of groups are going to use. Most of the groups that like I talked and work with that lived in same spaces all had the same ERP. That was very much the gold standard. When you talk about like medium to large size, but not quite like SAP style ERPs, I see a lot of groups looking at Sage X. I always pronounce it Sage X. It might be Sage 10. And there are other ERPs in that system as well that have some amount of the dedicated time and experience focus, but might not necessarily and so it will be less expensive, less painful, less time consuming to go get it up and running for your facility, despite the fact that all of them are very expensive and time consuming to go get them up and running for your facility. I feel like that feel like the higher up the stack you get, the more important it is to go through a product selection to understand the positives and negatives. And uh, ERP and MES, especially, maybe when you get to SCADA, most of the time, if you buy a system, especially a system prepared for an industry, you have to go through the process of determining if you want your system to run one to one as to how it currently runs, right? Do you want your processes to be 100% what they are now? Or do you want your processes to move into more of what these systems call industry best practices and best standards? Or do you want some sort of blended mix, right? It is least expensive to just change all of your process. It's least money expensive to go change all of your process to what's built in there. It's more money expensive to go have all of your processes changed uh to work one to one with the ERP. So most groups that I find have some kind of blending of both. And I see that also in MESs or like PLM or like LIMS or that style solutions. Most of the time they have very set, this is how we go do things in the system. If you would like something else coded into the system, we can do that. It's just X number of hundreds of dollars an hour.
At what point do you start looking at new options for your ERP systems?
Ooh. Um, I guess I guess probably the easy answer is generally never. Not necessarily never, but those are almost certainly going to be like generational, right? Like you go, you set up an ERP, you run with it until it becomes readily evident that you have to go change. I feel like most leaderships, it's probably once in a generation, maybe twice in a generation, you go through the process because going and making an ERP transition is almost exclusively multiple years, right? Like I've seen groups run 5 to 10 years attempting to go get the build and then go make the handover. And these aren't even super large companies, Vlad, right? These are medium hundreds of millions of dollars a year. And they've got 4 locations and it's year 5 and it's 3 years after our drop dead go live was supposed to be. And here we are still kind of meddling along. So I find most of the time ERPs are very much once or maybe twice in a generation if you do it once at the beginning of your time there, sort of solutions. And I think that, well, if they're done right, and I feel like there's so much routing on it. Again, the higher in the stack you go, basically, if there's a huge cluster, then you may not still be working there. Like someone is going to go take the fall, take the blame for a failed implementation. And an ERP is certainly up there. But I would say generally once, maybe twice in a generation, are you going to go look through it? So maybe once every 20 years. Or thereabout, are you going to go look and go through the process of doing these ERPs? Now, there are some people like outside groups that do ERP selection, and almost exclusively on the ERP side, are you going to go work through a third party consultant, preferred solutions provider vendor in order to go do a bunch of these builds of those solutions at your facility? And then I would also say there are some executives who come in and one of the things they do is they go change ERPs. But I would say
Mhm.
as an organization outside of being sold or outside of something happening, generally probably once every 20 years or so, just because of how long and time consuming it is. I'd say the difference in technology today versus 10 years ago is huge, but I also think that the vast majority of groups are looking at ERPs and other solutions along the lines of, how do I say it? They're looking at it along the lines of how can we go and build something and continue to get software updates, right? So we want to continue to get revs and versions and software updates. We want to be able to go buy new modules. ERPs are generally sold as modules, or you buy the base or the base X number of modules, which is how some ERPs have MES and other, in theory, manufacturing specific solutions in them.
Let me ask you maybe a different question, but on the same train of thought, right? So I've certainly been on a couple of projects where, we wanted to get data from the production floor into an ERP. But
Yep.
in my experience, the amount of data, or I guess the type of data points an ERP system would be ingesting is, I don't want to say very limited, but I guess like fairly unsubstantial compared to all the data on the industrial automation side. What
Mhm.
kind of data have you seen maybe being linked from the production floor to an ERP and vice versa?
So I think that's very specific, right? So I guess that the data that I see a lot of on the ERP are financial data. So your accounts
Yes.
payable, your accounts receivable. I see a lot of HR. I see a lot of customer relationship management software. So basically, all of your customers and all of the information about them and all of the information about the people that work for them, all of your vendors, all of the people who work for them, all of the information who work about them. If you have good reps, they are adding notes and updating things like that. So you'll know maybe birthdays or kids' names or things along that line, to be able to go have good conversations with them. And if someone is the number one person you want to talk to, you know who that person is for that issue, et cetera, et cetera. Again, I said, you see lots of financial. I, in the past, have done a lot of inventory management. So I had entire companies' inventories, like warehouse inventories on there. I have built a couple of times to varying degrees of success, a bunch of supply chain information like reorder points and general seasonal trending and other notes like that, because sometimes you don't want, because sometimes there's like a winter thing that you want to make sure you have stocked up for, but you're not going to go buy it or restock to the highest level in the summer because that doesn't necessarily make sense. So I see a lot of those. And then when we get to like process information, generally, I guess sometimes I see an MES, and I have played around. I've not worked on, but I've played around with, I think, mostly the SAP, maybe the Microsoft Dynamics MES module. I don't know it typically. I don't know it horribly well, but typically you would go pull information, and almost certainly not real-time process information, but almost certainly like historian information, time series database information from that, and then either aggregate it before it gets pushed into the MES level of information in your ERP, or maybe the ERP aggregates that. But we want to be very particular and specific on data points, right? That they are huge architectures, very large systems, even systems that don't have a lot of information in them. It's not uncommon to take extended periods to boot or do other things with. So you want to be very particular and very specific and not ask it to go ingest tens or hundreds of thousands of lines of information. Whenever I would go like pull a SQL database or go upload a changed SQL database to an ERP, half the time it would just lock up the laptop I was using. And a not insignificant part of the time, it's you go press the button, you see the bar starting to move across the screen. And then once you see the bar starting to go move across the screen, you go to the bathroom, you get a cup of coffee, you eat lunch, you do kind of all of those things. And you come back, and 15 to 30 minutes later, it's hopefully done and it's hopefully complete and it hasn't failed. So that has been a lot of my experience with them. Not saying that they're all like that. We see lots of newer age ones that are very mobile first and much more responsive. But like legacy ERPs, in my experience, have been along the lines of they're large architecturally systems. You need to be gentle with them. Going and trying to push a bunch of real time information in them is not the best idea. And again, those are just the ones that I've seen and personally worked with.
Yeah, that's, to be honest with you, my thought as well. Like I said, I've been in a couple of conversations where folks at the business level want to see certain manufacturing data, and then, when discussed a little bit further, they would, how to say it, like back away from the requests, because I think just pushing information to the ERP level, sure, it's easy enough to do if there's good endpoints or APIs, but at the end of the day, it's what are you going to do with that information? Is there, flows within the tools that can facilitate certain things? And I've not seen a lot of those, like already being implemented, or even the possibility of being implemented. So just because you ingest data at that level, I frankly have not seen very specific use cases besides, the one I think that we discussed in SPS, where a company was getting orders from the customers and pushing that data down to the production floor for like scheduling purposes. So that
Yeah.
I think was like an interesting use case, but that
I
was a
think
very
that
small company that
I think that vertically integrated is very much an ideal goal. The best example that I've seen of that is Walmart, right? So and I have not used the Walmart system at like an enterprise level, but like the Walmart system is built so much as that they have like lots of trucks moving, they have a few warehouses, and historically it's been very much just in time. So everyone knows the different levels of stock that each store has, and I don't. I think it's an algorithm. I imagine it's an algorithm at this point, but it makes the decision on what needs to go on the truck in order to hit the warehouse store, so that the shelves can stay fullish with having the smallest amount of hard goods at the store warehouses at any point in time, because there is a higher leverage and potential of having the items at the central distribution facility, because it could go to any of 5 or 10 or 50 Walmarts, as opposed to sitting on a particular Walmart's shelf not being sold.
yeah. Let me transition us towards maybe some of the last topics in the stack, right? So I think we mentioned this a little bit, but software running in the cloud, what kind of applications have you seen? What are maybe people doing with it? What are your general opinions and or thoughts when it comes to cloud-based or cloud-first software?
So I think the cloud-based applications are really interesting, and you and I have discussed maybe a little bit on stream, but certainly off stream. Man, it wasn't all that many years ago that I was sitting at a Rockwell Automation Fair, probably like 6 years ago. Yeah, I think about 6 years ago at this point, listening to a bunch of guys basically say they're never going to push anything to the cloud, right? Like they're not going to push even duplicates of their stuff to the cloud because they're not sure what the FDA would think about the duplicate of their information, and maybe we're basically just using that as an excuse. We've seen that to, man, we want to push everything to the cloud. I don't want to own any, like, I basically don't want to own any line side or facility side servers. I want to push everything to the cloud. And then somewhere in between those, we saw lots of issues with that. I forget the name of the one monitoring software that like every 6 months you'd see someone got like a $200,000 bill when their average bill was $20 because they did something and used a bunch of compute. I think we've seen that come back to more of a line side probably makes sense. Line side servers, facility side servers probably makes sense. We should probably do first level or maybe first and second level of analysis on there. We should go aggregate that information to key important points, and then we can take that and we can go push it up to the cloud. And I feel like up in the cloud could be an AWS, it could be an Azure, it could be a GCP, it could be like a private cloud hosting or co-location facility hosting. And then from there, we in theory get the best of both worlds, right? We own our information. If there is a line down issue, if we take the fiber down or something like that, we're still okay because we have our information at the facility. But we can use all of these cool advanced analytics and AI and other tools that are being hosted and used in the cloud.
Yeah, look, I agree with all those points. I think that at least in my conversations, as you mentioned, I think manufacturers are still reluctant depending on the software that's going to be running in the cloud, but I've seen much more disastrous, I want to say, data collection systems at their local facility that and I give you this example where they were using a factory talk USC instance on like an
Mhm.
isolated PC to store FDA regulated data on like a
Okay.
128 gig hard drive that would fill up after like 2 days and then need to be replaced by IT. So I think there's a lot of arguments to be made that, when we talk about cloud, I think there's services that have already been figured out by people who are very smart. So I think not leveraging them is doing yourself a disservice. But the counter argument is, as you mentioned, maybe you have a couple of layers of protection there, right? So
Mhm,
at the end of the day, you know the requirements for your business, whether that's 5 years or 7 years of FDA regulated data. Well, maybe you can have a local backup, but also you can push that onto maybe not one, maybe two clouds for if you're paranoid or risk losing that data
mhm,
for one reason or another. But I think those options are fairly easy to implement today, so I really don't see any advantage to not, I guess, utilizing them. And I think maybe to continue when it comes to the cloud, I think we see now more and more of these, and I put AI as a question mark,
mhm,
but I want to say like these proprietary tools and services that you simply, I guess it doesn't make sense from a financial standpoint for most manufacturers to go hire a team and to create a generative AI processor, which already can be deployed via different cloud architectures if you're looking for something beyond chat gpt on a personal level, but you're looking to
mhm.
process like large sets of data. So I really don't see a way for manufacturers to innovate without using some of those services. But like I said, of course, within reason and with proper guardrails, should things, fail or not work out, which again, I don't think the cost is that significant to R&D some of these different cloud features, at least in my opinion and experience.
Absolutely. I think, especially when we talk about cloud, and maybe edge and maybe third party apps, there's generally very low monetary barriers of entry. I think it would be best in order to have people go through the process of trying different things out. Try to see what works. Yeah, try and see what works for you and for your team and facility. Vlad, we
Agreed.
are about up on time. We have done a remarkably good job of getting through our bullet points, although we still have more than a couple left. Do we want to put together some closing thoughts for the listeners?
Closing thoughts, right? I guess we can maybe hit that last bullet point really quickly when it comes to maybe real problems and sort of give our brief opinion and advice when it comes to what you should be considering in the software selection process. So I think, if I can start on that side, I think the question we wrote down as what are the real problems when it comes to software and IT/OT conversions, right? And we've heard that and I think now for, I don't want to say a decade, but a number of years, that there is a problem between what we call OT or operational technology and IT. And so to me, I look at that at a very high level in three aspects, right? So people, process, and technology. I think everyone's kind of familiar with that, not acronym, but what's the, I guess, the three pillars of implementation. And my opinion, again, as I've maybe stated earlier on in this stream, is that there's not enough emphasis on the people and process as much as there seems to be on technology in our industry. And what I mean more specifically is number one, I've seen many initiatives fail not because of lack of tools, but rather lack of education and I guess maybe patience to some extent and sort of process that helps the people go through a change management initiative to having no tool or to having a certain tool being replaced by a new tool and then being able to leverage the information that the quote unquote new tool provides, which ultimately should be helping them solve a problem, right? On the process side, again, I think it's very important to recognize what it takes to implement some of these solutions. And the higher up the stack you go, the more, at least from my experience, engineering time it will require to understand the process, to understand different data points, to understand the architecture, to be able to implement those solutions in a way that makes sense for that specific business. So I think those two elements are usually underemphasized, right? There's going to be a lot of tools that you look at today that will tell you, well, it's almost plug and play. And I think that my experience on the pre-work to implementing the tool and the post-work suggests otherwise. What are your thoughts on that side, Dave?
I would agree. I think in a industry that very little is sexy or appealing, technology can be, right? Like, especially when we talk about cloud, especially when we talk about AI, especially when we talk about a bunch of these solutions that have really cool high vis pages, it becomes the conversation of, hey, look at this technology and let's focus on technology. But I think the lack of people and engagement is an issue on both sides, right? Lots of groups don't know or understand the value of focusing on education, and so they, as service providers, don't focus on the education, and end users say, hey, I don't need to focus on the education because of X, Y, and Z reasons, right? Like, we have internal trainers or other things, or we build the technology, they'll go figure it out. And I almost exclusively see that end incorrectly, right? Like, those are poor statements. Those are poor statements when it comes to kind of those thoughts and facts. Having said that, I think it's a biggest opportunity for most groups is to very much work on the process, to very much work on the people side to very much work on the people side of that. And I, again, as I said earlier, and tell I think every client I ever talk to, that is absolutely 100% where we will see high value come to everyone, and where we'll see groups succeed into the future and versus struggle and fail into the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's maybe transition to the final questions of the conversation, Dave. So let me shoot that first question at you. What do you see as the future of software in manufacturing and industrial automation?
I think that we're going to see a lot of these different stacks get rolled up. Again, as we had talked about, I think we're going to see a lot of them consolidated, and or we're going to see some of these smaller groups not able to not able to go figure it out. So I guess in short, I think we're going to see lots of SCADA and MES and Edge and these third party solutions. I think we will, in the next 2 to 5 years, see a much smaller market, but we'll see a much better concentration, be it vertical or industry, and some groups pulling much further ahead when it comes to leading the way in those industries. Vlad, what are your thoughts of the future?
I think for me, like one interesting concept that I've been thinking about when it comes to software in the space is marketplaces, right? And I think I've mentioned
Hmm.
this, I think both at the edge level, but also at sort of like the cloud or like higher level for manufacturers. And what I mean by marketplaces, right, is the ability to pull a module, which we already see a lot of the, SCADA or MES types of tools have. But ultimately, if I'm a manufacturer in a certain industry, I want to be able to pull a package that allows me to monitor, let's say, my batches, right? And if I
Hmm.
don't want to monitor batches, maybe I have a process that's a bit more discrete, then I can pull a tool that allows me to monitor, OE of that process. And if
Hmm.
I want to, I don't know, monitor my drives or I want to monitor my PLCs for, let's say, like cybersecurity, right? So I want to be automatically be able to map my PLCs, say what kind of firmware level they are, see what kind of patches they're running, and detect the vulnerabilities. Then that should be like a specific module, right? And obviously the pricing models can be figured out, but I think that creates a ecosystem of these sort of like smaller tools that can be deployed in some. I think in some cases it makes sense to deploy them at the edge if they're small enough, but if they're maybe a large type of a solution, it makes sense to have them on enterprise grade servers, whether that's at the facility or in the cloud. So I think that's hopefully the future where your project for integration is not completely custom. There's sort of off the shelf pieces that you could pull in and immediately get value on whatever that you may need for your specific system. And I also hope, maybe touching a little bit on the pricing model, that there's a way for you to grow with the solution, right? I think that a lot of sort of like hardware and software is inaccessible or cost prohibitive for smaller manufacturers,
Mhm.
versus the larger ones for whom it's a drop in the bucket. But I hope that this sort of software paradigm, which we've seen on the IT side, will allow you to, depending on, let's say, how many connections or how many modules, you can sort of scale the pricing and it be virtually free for those who are, a smaller, let's call it producer, and more costly as you grow your business.
I would think that very marketplaces feel to for marketplaces, you're gonna have to have like the App Store or the Google Play Store where everyone puts their solution in one or maybe two marketplaces. If every group has their own marketplace, I don't think marketplaces as a whole will be successful. I don't want to have subscriptions to 10 or 20 different marketplaces in order to get everything that I need.
Well, that's the problem, right? I think that's going to be
Mhm.
the like we have to see how the cards play out. I think everybody wants to be the provider of all apps, just like in the,
Mhm.
let's call it, Android or iOS space. But I agree with you. I think it's gonna almost be, how would I put it? I think it's gonna get worse before it gets better, right? We're gonna see a bunch of players with their own marketplaces, and then
Mhm.
there's gonna be one or two winners who will sort of consolidate all the rest. Um, what is your career advice for us today, Dave?
Absolutely. I feel like I've had kind of a similar conversation with a few people in the last few weeks. But I guess it boils down to, if you're not happy doing what you're doing, life is too short to be unhappy working in a position or with a group that you're unhappy working. I think it's super important to go get experience. I don't think any work environment is all rainbows and unicorns and we get 20 minutes of work done over the course of the week that we can do from our pajamas at home and everyone just pays us $1 million a year. I don't think that that is reality. But if you are truly unhappy and you work with people who you don't enjoy being around and they might not enjoy being around you, life is too short. Don't be afraid to go make a change.
I hear that in France, it is illegal to make somebody work past 35 hours, and you typically get 8 weeks worth of vacation as you start off. So something to consider.
Bienvenue, Vlad. Welcome to France.
See, I could make that move really easily.
You could.
Um, Look, on my side, I think it's continue to be curious. I think that and I talk to way too many people who get stuck, whether that's, on the technical side or even, in management, who just seem to be there because they have been there, like, on that path, right? And so when I say, like, be curious, is I think, like, now more than ever, there's so many ways to either read or educate yourself on a variety of topics that in some instances may not be relevant to what you're currently doing, but ultimately give you thoughts that are applicable, in the long run. So I think being curious about different areas, how things are done in different industries, how to, I guess, how to perform in certain careers or different aspects of life is
Mhm.
important. So I think my advice is, stay curious. What do you have as maybe book or content recommendation for us? What are you listening to? What are you reading?
So Vlad, I was in fact desperately scrolling through the things that I've read and listened to recently in preparation of this. And honestly, I was on vacation around the 4th of July and I read like 3,000 pages of absolute trash. So you guys will not get my fantasy adventure or mystery drama or mystery drama things. I guess I've got two things. One, something that I just figured out and still need to figure out a bit more. on Spotify. We have been Spotify Premium members for a while because there is very few things that I would hate more in life than having to listen to ads when I listen to music, and I love being able to download them. They have a bunch of audiobooks. I think some of the audiobooks are free, or all of the audiobooks are free. If you are a premium member, although I downloaded a bunch after I heard about this, and half of them have the lock sign on it. So I still have to figure that out. But if you guys are Spotify premium members, I would take a look because I think that that is super interesting. And then I would say on the podcast side, long term listeners will know that I have recommended the Cortex podcast in the past, which is basically a super meta business podcast. A couple of guys from the UK basically talk about their business. I'm looking, they're now episode 155 or 156. I think it's really interesting because they created a business based around the podcast that they created together, and they made some physical product, and it talks about their experience with the other businesses that they both have. One is a podcaster, the other is a YouTuber. And on episode 155, one of my like favorite-ish episodes of the year is they talk about state of the hardware, and they go through all of the phones, all of the hardware. They're super tech guys, right? And so they go
That they're
through all of
using
that. Yep,
all the
that
hardware.
that they're using. Vlad, they talk for almost 3 hours. They talk for almost 3 hours on this. I thought it's interesting. I like listening to those, and I also like listening to State of the Apps because every once in a while I will find an interesting app or an interesting piece of hardware that might be worth going through, and that might be worth going through and giving a try. I always like
Well,
listening
like
to
what?
other.
Anything
Oh goodness.
stands out?
So there was actually a super random one that I listened to. Let me go and hold on a
And
second.
you're telling me they tried all of these? I'm looking at the list for this episode. There's like
They actively use this massive weird ads for like one of those pocket tripods that folds down into like the size of a credit card, and you can put in your wallet. I thought that was super interesting, right? You look at it and it's got the ability to tilt, it's got the ability to do a bunch of things. And I'm like, I'm not sure if this is the best thing ever or just a waste of $30. And so I like different applications like that. For all of the rest of the world who aren't Vlad, who work on iOS and Apple devices, one of my favorite apps that I use literally every day is an app called Drafts. It allows cross-functional syncing around all of my iOS, around my entire iOS ecosystem. It's a paid-for app. It was recommended through those guys. The calendar app that I use and like and also pay for called Fantastical, where I've got like, I don't know, 4 to 8 calendars at any point in time, all condensed into one place. Also, I believe a recommendation a number of years ago from there. So spend spend with people each time to these going through all these different applications, and so state of the apps and state of the hardware as well.
interesting. I'll have to look through this list because there's a lot of stuff, and I'm surprised they're using. Like, I don't know who buys this much tech, but maybe
Uh,
there's like I'm looking at Flex smart buttons, wireless buttons
Yes.
for all your
So
smart home
they're
improvements.
super into home automation, Vlad. Super into home automation. Uh, they both have like desk stuff and then also travel stuff. And they're like, I want to be able to have a backpack that is always packed. And so they own duplicate or triplicates of lots of the different things they own. Again, they all make money off of these sort of things, right? Like they're big into tech and podcasting and videos and things like that, and that is where they make their money. So
Is
for
that where we're
very,
headed?
almost certainly not, Vlad.
We're
Almost
not part of the
certainly not.
meta where the podcast becomes the business we talk about, and we buy gadgets for the podcast, and then we talk about the gadgets. about the
Vlad, I
podcast.
have lots of thoughts on that, but that would push this episode way long. What is
Yeah,
your book slash content recommendation for us today?
sure. So I had an interesting debate with a close friend of mine about how do you choose restaurants, right? Like, how do you choose where do you go to eat? And I think maybe I made actually like a post on LinkedIn about this. But anyways, the point is, do you choose a place that you've already been to, or do you go to a new place? And so I had this debate because I'm more of a, how do you say, when you watch movies, there's sometimes like a it's in Denzel Washington movie about not John. I'm not thinking about John Wick, but anyways, the point is, he has like a diner where he gets breakfast at the same time every single day, right? So
Yeah.
that's how I like to I like to figure out what are the best places that I sort of want to become familiar with, and they become sort of the routine. Versus, my friend was arguing that he wants to go to a new place to figure out something new every single time.
Hmm.
And like I said, I always had a thought that there must be an algorithm for this. Well, it there is. So
Okay.
there's an actual like computer-based algorithm. And so the book is called Algorithms to Live By: The Computer Science of Human Decisions
Okay.
by Brian Christian and Tom Griffiths. But the point of the book is much deeper than that, right? Like it could be as trivial of, they actually talk about the restaurant dilemma, right? And I'm not gonna spoil the details, but it's also, how do you choose the perfect, let's call it like life partner for you, right? Because on one side, you could, let's say, date for the next 10 years, or you could settle on the first person that you find, right? So there's like more existential problems that are, how to say it, more important to solve than how to pick a restaurant. But it also, I think it ties back to what I said a lot on the industrial automation side, where is, how do you, how do you decide, whether a solution has been good enough? How do you migrate to different solutions? How do you educate people in a way that sort of makes sense for them, right? So there's a lot of human decisions that we have figured out algorithmically what the approach is. And so this book talks about a lot of different scenarios and what does the algorithm say. Um, and I guess to spoil it just a little bit, the magic number is 38%, right? So, well, what does that mean? Well, it means if you were to, let's say, if you had a pool of candidates that you wanted to hire from of 100 people, and obviously this is if you have zero data on any of them, this is not, you
Hmm.
have the resume and they obviously don't fit, but imagine that it's 100 applicants that you know nothing about. Well, the first 38% of them, which in this case, 38 out of 100,
Hmm.
you would look at without, how to say it, without the ability to choose either one, right? So you would just assess for 38 people. And then the next one that is better than your benchmark from those 38, you must hire. So, long story short, the same principle applies to, so subconsciously when we were purchasing a house,
Hmm.
I, told my wife, like, hey, like, let's go look at a few places just so we understand a little bit better what the market looks like, what can we get at our price range. But that's the same. So the algorithm, the computer calculated number, and they explain in the book why, is 38. So you need to see, if you're planning to look at 100 houses total, you should see
Hmm.
38 without putting any deposit on or down payment on. Anyways, super interesting book.
It's a lot of houses to view without the intention of purchasing or putting an offer on. I think it's
Well,
interesting.
38 is a percentage, right? So if, like, let's say if
Hmm.
if you are, so here's how it works. Let's say you're like, I want to buy a house in the next 3 months, right?
Hmm.
What can you realistically see in the next 3 months, or how many houses could you see in 3 months? Well, you could calculate, I don't know, like five a weekend, and so you would just take
Oh.
38% of that number, right? It's not necessarily like 38 is just if you can do 100, but it could also be time based, right? So if you want to buy in 3 months, like 38 is roughly, like a month and maybe like a week. So you would spend a month and a week looking at houses without expectation of buying. And then the other 2 months, whatever house that comes up. comes up that meets your benchmark based on those that first month visits, you have to put a down payment on.
Interesting. Interesting. I like how there's an algorithm for what I imagine are extremely emotional decisions. So thank you for that. We'll have the book below. Vlad, last question to you first is how can our listeners help? Who should reach out? Who you're looking to connect with? Any and all of those things.
Sure. So I think in a general sense, always happy to talk about manufacturing, industrial automation across the stack, of course. Ultimately, on the Solus PLC side, always looking for instructors or always looking for companies we can provide training for at, the PLC through the SCADA level. So if you're interested in upskilling engineers, technicians, or if you're looking for solutions in that space, very happy to have that conversation. And like I said, conversely, if you're looking to educate people and you are a good technical slash, I guess, technical educator, happy to have that conversation as well. How about you, Dave?
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, you guys, if you guys are longtime listeners, you know me. If you don't know me, if you guys are new listeners, if you are interested in having conversations around the things that we talk about on Manufacturing Hub, always happy to look out, have conversations about that. Specifically, work. I'm doing a bunch of ignition work. So if you guys are looking for ignition development, please give me a ring. Or drop me a message. Beyond that, I've been having lots of conversations about AI in manufacturing and workshops and use cases. So if that interests you or your executive leadership, please let me know for that as well. Vlad, this might be the longest episode we have ever done. Both you and I together and Manufacturing Hub as a whole, we have cracked the 100-minute mark. Everyone, thank you for hanging out with Vlad and I. This has been episode 173. If you've made it this far, make sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons. Make sure you're following Vlad, myself. Make sure you're following Manufacturing Hub. If you made it this far on podcast format, you are amazing and have probably listened to the longest episode that we've ever put in podcast format as well. Please rate us 5 stars, like, subscribe.